Greetings. Good morning, afternoon, evening. My name is Ilmi Granoff. I'm the director of the ClimateWorks Foundation's Sustainable Finance Program, and I'm also a senior associate at the University of College London's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. It's really great to be speaking with you today. I am your moderator. Thank you for joining this interaction forum about green recovery from COVID-19 and the opportunities and challenges set forth for the international finance community on addressing the climate crisis in that context. In general, this session is meant to be at a sort of introductory level conversation. We're going to try to cover some of the key contextual themes with our two excellent expert panelists. We have the pleasure of hearing from Kevin Gallagher and Sejal Patel. First, I'll introduce Kevin. Dr. Kevin Gallagher is a professor of global development policy at Boston University's Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies, where he directs the Global Development Policy Center. In addition to having written over 6 books, Professor Gallagher serves on the United Nations Committee for Development Policy and co-chairs the T20 Task Force on the International Financial Architecture at the G20. And next, I'd like to introduce Sejal Patel. Ms. Patel is a climate change research and economist at the International Institute for Environment and Development, and her work focuses on international, national, and local level climate policy responses and resourcing. Prior to IED, she worked as a research officer for the Climate and Energy Policy Team at the Overseas Development Institute, where I myself once had an affiliation. Her current work focuses on the political economic assessment of adaptive interventions, analysis of climate policies and financing under the UNFCCC framework and the Sustainable Development Goals, and supporting the development of innovative financing to promote local action on climate change. Listeners should feel free to post questions in the chat box. Please include your name and organization when you type questions, and we will acknowledge that. Introducing the topic further, we know that there's a direct link between fossil fuels and extreme poverty. And in fact, my work at the ODI was intended to underscore the number of people drawn back into extreme poverty by climate change, and that was a major concern for those of us wanting to eliminate extreme poverty and lift people out in the coming decades. We also know the scale of the climate challenges has created a all hands on deck situation to bend the curve towards 1.5 degrees global mean temperature change, and that requires an enormous amount of economic transformation throughout the world's economies. Amidst this, we have the COVID-19 pandemic and an intensifying debt crisis that hamstrings developing countries' abilities and chances for a green and resilient recovery. We have a new constellation of creditors. Sovereign creditors continue to play a role, but so do the IMF, the multilateral development banks, and which may put a different constellation of institutions in a pivotal position to help transition and the green recovery, and how the repayment obligations of those states that are in debt crisis are structured may really determine their ability to respond to COVID-19, climate change, and green and resilient development. In addition, the US has just come back on the scene and really may change things. So that obviously is part of the context. So I'll start with a pretty broad question for you, Kevin. Why, in your view, is acting now so important? And what are the time constraints that you see with respect to addressing the debt crisis, recovery, and climate change?
Well, first of all, it's great to be on, and I'm honored to be on here with my fellow panelists. And thanks to all of you for coming. This is the most important decade of our times. The world community before COVID had committed to an accelerated development plan by 2030, and that we have collectively been working to mobilize trillions of dollars for the transition that you talked about, not only a transition from a high carbon to a low carbon economy, but to one that's more socially inclusive and just. So just at the time where the world community needs to be mobilizing trillions of dollars on an annual basis till 2030, most important decade, this is a time when we've had the biggest collapse in the world economy since the Great Depression. Normally, after a collapse, we do what we're doing now, borrowing a lot of money, spending to get out of the crisis in the first couple of years. That can leave what's called a big debt overhang. It can countries that have too much debt can run into problems in paying it back, which we're already seeing with more than 7 or 8 countries defaulting since COVID started. And that's an environment where normal, or in the past, international institutions and the global community has said it's time to tighten our belts and not spend money. And usually that happens for a good decade or so. We can't afford a decade of austerity, of fiscal consolidation. This is the decade for stretching and maximizing balance sheets as much as we can. And so this is the thing that is hitting us right now. This crisis couldn't have come at the worst time. However, we have the means to use this crisis to mobilize that finance better than we were even before it.
Thank you, Kevin. Sejal, could you share with us what you think the current state of play is among the International Monetary Fund and the multilateral development banks on green debt? What opportunities do they have to move the needle? How is their role different than in previous contexts? And how do we think of them as playing a role in addressing the crisis?
Thanks, Ilmi. And just to start by saying thank you for having me on this panel. I think that's a great question, and it leads into what Kevin is talking about with this crisis. And the time is now to be acting on supporting both countries with all the economic difficulties and distress faced from COVID, and with helping keep climate and nature on the agenda, because all three are global crises that are interdependent. So there's a lot of potential right now across the multilateral players, the bilateral players, and the private sector to move the needle, I think. So in your opening statement, you referenced only the US and President Biden's climate plans, where he's in the US executive order on climate change, they talk about providing green debt relief, and particularly putting that behind climate commitments. And I think that's a really strong signal that there's momentum building here from the US and from international players. And one of the key aspects of that could link into the IMF's SDR allocation, so the special drawing rights, and that supports liquidity. And there are discussions going on at the moment around whether those allocations can be linked to climate vulnerable countries and whether there should be green allocations. Another key a key kind of movement coming from the multilaterals, and particularly the IMF, who have been working with the World Bank, the OECD, and the UN, is in developing this platform that they are intending to present at the spring meetings this year. And the platform is around linking climate and nature to debt. And essentially what they're exploring is a facility where they'll be able to support financial instruments that link climate and nature to debt. That will be quite a game changer, I think. That will open up to a lot of countries the opportunity to link some of their priorities in these areas to some of the instruments that are critically needed right now.
That's great. And we may circle back to the special drawing rights as an important part of this sort of relief package, but focusing on debt, if we have time, focusing on debt. Kevin, turn to you. How about other creditors? Only a third of this debt is now from the sort of historic bilateral creditors. A third is private institutions, and a third is international financial institutions. And even that third that is sort of from bilaterals is now a different constellation than historic crises. How does that change the calculus as to how we create a response, an international response to the crisis?
Yeah, global debt and financial markets are much more complex than they were the last time we had a big crunch like this in the 1980s and 1990s, when there were just the international financial institutions, some bilateral creditors, and just a handful of commercial banks making sort of plain bank loans. It was much easier to bring everybody to the table. They were all concentrated in a handful of countries and try to collectively come up with solutions. And our solutions really fall into a couple categories. New liquidity, like special drawing rights that Shajal mentioned, new financing, concessional and non-concessional, and then debt relief, because some countries can't take on any new money except for with respect to grants. Now, as an American, it's sort of amazing, given the fact that the Trump administration was so anti-multilateralism, that the G20 created two mechanisms to deal with some of these issues. One is called the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which suspends payments for the 70 poorest countries of the world for those bilateral creditors. Like you said, Ilmi, a third of all this debt in emerging market and developing countries is Paris Club, French, United Kingdom, United States bilateral official loans to countries, and another big chunk of that is China, Saudi Arabia. So the G20 created two schemes to deal with that pool of finance. One, the DSSIs I just said, say, hey, if you're having trouble making payments, we'll suspend the payments. Now payments have been suspended through July of 2021. Hopefully we'll suspend that for a little bit longer, given how long it's taking for the vaccine to get to developing countries. The second thing that was created is called the Common Framework for going beyond the DSSI, which means if countries are having trouble even deeper than not being able to make payments, they're not going to be able to meet the general obligations of some of these loans. That allows you to go into conversations with your creditors about reducing the overall value of that debt. That is an important first step, but it only deals with the third of the story. And that really creates some real misalignment because China, for instance, can say in Zambia, which right now Zambia is a country that it took advantage of the DSSI and now has gone to the Common Framework. Obviously, to make sure we stay on track, what this panel is about is how do we make this recovery be one where we make everyone safe and healthy, we protect the vulnerable while doing it, and then we mount a green and inclusive recovery that accelerates us towards these goals we have for 2030. If, say, China, the Paris Club, through this G20 scheme, gives Zambia some debt relief, Zambia cannot use that financing to go and attack the virus, pay for vaccines, and put together a stimulus package. They've got to turn around and use any new space that comes from that. They're paying bondholders in New York or where Sajal is in London, or they're paying the IMF or the World Bank. And so we have a scheme. I think a lot of us have concerns even about how well it works just for the poorest countries. It's clearly not explicitly linked, like Sajal said, to any development and environmental outcomes. But at least it's a scheme. We don't have a scheme for the IFIs, and we don't have a scheme for the private sector. The IFIs, like Sajal said, are coming up with a new set of instruments that might help countries get new money if they can get it, and debt relief if not. Let's see what that looks like coming into April. Let's put pressure on there to make sure that it really links, that goes beyond the poorest countries and links new financing and debt relief to a green and inclusive recovery. The big gap is the private sector. The private sector has not been, there's no compulsory rules for them to join this debt relief, and they've really been holding back. And this is going to take leadership at the global level. I've written an article I can put in the chat called 2021, Time for U.S. Leadership on Multilateralism and a Sustainable Recovery, that was in the journal Global Policy, which echoes some proposals that Sean Hagan, who was the former head of the legal counsel of the IMF, who's now at the Peterson Institute has shown is that with some executive orders, the United Kingdom and the United States, because the City of London and New York are where most of the bond contracts are, with executive orders, we could get the private sector to the table to make it be compulsory for them to be part of this conversation too. Strongly urge the Biden administration to move to that after we get our SDR allocation.
So it's not a sort of unformed process where private creditors are kind of everywhere, but actually in a relatively few jurisdictions. If I understand, Kevin, you could have a response from government that would bring them to the table. Is that right?
Yes, there was legislation in the UK under the HIPC initiative, with a lot of our constituents are going to be more familiar with, perhaps, than the three of us on this panel. So there was legislation in the UK that made it compulsory for private sector actors to be a component of that. And in the US, there was an executive order around the Iraq war that made it compulsory for private sector actors to play a role in restructuring and earmarking Iraq's debt after the Iraq war. Those are two instruments that many in the legal community are saying could pull those actors to the table. Thank you.
I'm gonna actually do one more follow up, and said, "Oh, you're gonna get a few in a row as well," because I want to follow up on one point here that as we're delving into this, I'm sure that private creditors' responses will be that asking for too many concessions from them will spook the market and cause a withdrawal of private credit to developing countries in the future. What do we make sense of? I mean, we can anticipate that will be the main response from private creditors about haircuts or other modifications to the terms of their agreements with these states. How do you think about that? Is it credible? What are its limits? We know that will be the response. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's not very credible of an argument. Obviously, when a country moves into one of these arrangements, it is a technical default. But many, by the time they get to that stage, there's not too much further below for them to go. And evidence shows after a country restructures its debt, the definition of that puts them in a better situation to be able to return to debt sustainability and return to markets. So even though the private sector is often the last, they drag it. If they did it earlier, it would be better for the host countries and for their own balance sheets. But even if you go all the way to the bottom, there's nowhere else to go but up.
Great. Sejal, you brought up a tool that's getting a lot of attention in the conversations around how to address the economic crisis in a way that is green and resilient. The idea of using debt for climate swaps and its sort of predecessor, debt for nature swaps. Now, there's a long history of debt for nature swaps. I myself am having trouble identifying what the limits of these tools are, where they're useful, how much of the problem they tackle, how scalable they are. Are these swaps sort of most useful for nature versus other types of climate-related needs that might be part of the package? Can you give us a calibration of how to understand where this particular instrument plays a role?
Sure. So debt for nature swaps, as you mentioned, were some of these smaller swaps that had been happening since the 1980s, 1990s, that kind of era. And they were very sort of limited and piecemeal transactions. But I guess the kind of underlying mechanics of it is that a country, a debtor country, will agree with the creditor country to exchange some of the debt, to restructure the debt that's being held there. And the benefits from that restructure would then be going to a nature outcome. So what's being suggested now is a kind of reformation of that concept, where you're still having this agreement between the creditor and the debtors, and that might be something around converting the currency of the debt to local currency, or lowering the interest rate, or it could be to do with transactions on the secondary market, which enable the debt to be paid back at a cheaper cost. But now I guess there are a few changes from the learnings from the past. So one of the big changes, and also what Kevin was talking about, is that these transactions need to include a degree of debt relief as well as the debt being swapped. Because when countries are using this tool, they're already facing some sort of debt distress in general. And so it's not enough to swap all of the debt. They also need some fiscal space. So debt relief will help support that, as well as then putting some spending against climate and nature objectives. And so the new term that's coming out is debt for climate and nature swaps, but I guess it's also moving to a more kind of broader term, debt management for climate and nature. So what it's allowing is for countries to manage their debt before it becomes unsustainable. So it doesn't really become a useful tool once a country is already in severe debt distress, at which point, there's a high risk of default. What it is a very useful tool for is for countries that are needing fiscal space and are at risk of going into debt distress. And what it helps them do is manage the need for fiscal space, but also it can keep up with some of the climate and nature priorities, so those don't get left off the agenda. And so, as well as ensuring some debt relief, I guess there's a couple of other components that become quite integral to this. One is about scale. So it is about what we've been talking about, bringing all the creditors to the table and ensuring a more kind of an inclusive approach to managing debt. So it's not just bilateral creditors, it's looking at all the creditors and putting all the creditors on an equal footing in supporting a debtor country. And that will help a larger amount of funds to be mobilized, which is what's needed for this instrument to make an impact on fiscal space. And then the other key component is about using as much as possible government systems. So using something like budget support to help countries channel the money to where they need it to go. So there needs to be a strong degree of country ownership there. The climate and nature outcomes that are being defined in that tool needs to come from strategic priorities of that country, whether that's being communicated in nationally determined contribution documents or their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and really contributing to both growth enhancement and poverty reduction in the country as well. That's what's going to help economic resilience going forward.
Well, I'm going to come back to something you said there to make sense of this. I mean, my understanding is that this debt crisis has actually reached in well beyond least developed countries and is even starting to present challenges for some middle income countries. What country circumstances are sort of appropriate for this tool in the context of the crisis? Are there a subset of states where this is really an opportunity to present a package that serves their need, or is this more something that it's good to develop, but really it's not just about fiscal headroom? We have states that are just in absolute distress and on the risk of default. How do we make sense of that in terms of the constellation of countries and their different needs?
No, I think that's a really important question. And I think that's one that the World Bank, IMF, OECD, UN platform is looking to tackle as well. So what I was saying about the debt for climate and nature kind of instrument, that does look at countries that are more that are less in debt distress, but more needing a kind of intervention right now to stop going into debt distress down the line, whether that's in a year or in a few years. And it supports countries that that have high climate and biodiversity potential, because it also needs that agreement with the creditors. And to do that, you have these climate and nature objectives that are supporting global benefits as well as national. But what this platform that the multilaterals are forming is trying to do is then classify these countries into different types and then support instruments that are suited to the different types of countries to be receiving or to access different instruments. So instruments that might be relevant to some LDCs and their circumstances in terms of their ability to borrow in the market, how much the cost of capital is, that they can access what climate and nature objectives they're sort of going for might be different to a middle income country. So I think it is all about ensuring that the instrument is fit for purpose for the different countries.
Thank you. That was really helpful contextualization. We hear a lot about some of these different instruments, but not sort of where they park in the constellation of tools that we need to respond to the crisis. So thank you. I want to zoom out a bit here for a second and think about sort of a higher level question around the response to a debt crisis. I mean, historically, Kevin, as you've alluded to, when there's been a crisis, there's a sort of a tension around the sort of need for countercyclical spending and the desire to respond to the crisis by replacing an enormous drop in demand from consumers and society with government spending. And yet we've typically associated our debt packages in these contexts with austerity conditionalities. And I'm wondering, how does the need for green mobilization and the need to mobilize economies in the next decades to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement on both adaptation and the net zero global economy by the middle of the century, how does that mobilization need sort of help us fight this question of austerity conditionality that's historically been associated with debt restructuring? And on this one, I actually am interested in hearing from both of you. Well, I'll start with Kevin, so you can take a break for a second, Sejal.
Yeah, I think this is a history that the constituency around interaction knows very well. That there's been a little bit of inconsistency and hypocrisy in the responses to major recessions in the world economy. In the North, where there's key currencies, the euro, the dollar, the yen, etc., you see counter-cyclical responses to big downturns like the financial crisis in 2008, where countries print money and put together massive stimulus packages. And we know from the examples of the United States and China in 2008, that worked pretty well. Got people back to work, got economies going, got fiscal balances back in better shape, and started to help reduce debt burdens. That's called expansionary fiscal policy, expansionary monetary policy. Oddly, the International Monetary Fund, when developing countries have run into those same kind of problems, they've prescribed and conditioned, as you said, Ilmi, the opposite approach, which is to almost act as if you have a fever and starve yourself, to reduce government spending, to raise interest rates, to really choke off the lifeline of an economy, so that investors outside of a country get more confidence and start investing again. The constituents around interaction really know that there's no controversy about the short-term impacts. Obviously, when you're cutting social spending, whether it be for the environment, education, health, or short-term livelihood support, that the poor get aggravated. The IMF program in 2018 and 19 in Ecuador, people took to the streets so much that they had to move the capital of Ecuador from Quito to Guayaquil in the middle of 2018, 2019. So we've seen this day in and day out, and this time has to be different. This time has to be the same kind of packages that we see in the North go into the South. We need financing that is non-conditional in terms of that actually can be counter-cyclical, that can be injected into the economy at a stepwise level for attacking the virus, protecting the vulnerable, and mounting a green recovery. Here in the United States, it looks like today or tomorrow, we're going to have a multi-trillion-dollar stimulus package, and we already have very ultra-low interest rates. That's the same framework that we need for the International Monetary Fund. Interaction folks have been working on those issues for many, many years. And what we've all come to realize now is that a green and just recovery has to be a core component of that. It has to be countercyclical funding that is also linked to a transition, which means that an amount of funding actually needs to even be larger than we would think about it, right? Emerging market and developing countries, some of them, their major means of foreign exchange are oil exports to the North. Their major means of foreign exchange are or the major energy supply for industrialization and urban living is in coal-fired power plants. And lots of people work for these things. The economy is all connected around that. So as the UN has showed us, we need fundamental structural transformation. So these short-term injections of financing have to be towards that goal, but they have to be working in tandem with other multilateral development finance institutions and national development finance institutions to help make the adjustment work, the people who are going to lose their jobs in old sectors, entrepreneurs that are in the fossil fuel sector to gain opportunities in new sectors. That's a medium and longer term process. Usually an IMF program derails that for a decade. This time it needs to accelerate that to meet our goals this decade.
So just to kind of reiterate the question here in a way, I'll extend this metaphor of a fever. It seems like historically we've treated developing countries in a debt crisis as having fever. I wonder if we sort of turn to the Washington consensus and the view that there was a sort of fever running in Washington around the need for austerity. And I wonder if green mobilization and the sort of needs of the coming decades and the unique situation that we're in as a global economy is a way of breaking that fever. And if you have views on how the current context may be different than previous decades.
Yeah, exactly. It's I think we've reached a point where we can't push some of these crises down the road. So you have growing needs for example, adaptation. The UNEP Adaptation Gap report is projecting that between now and 2030, developing country needs for adaptation are looking to be 140 to 300 billion a year, and that rises to around 500 billion a year by 2050, before 2050. And so these are huge needs that need investment and servicing. So if you look at it from that perspective, there needs to be more investment, and that will be lasting for decades ahead. It's something where right now, if the recovery isn't green, what you're doing is addressing the immediate economic challenges, but kicking kicking the crises down the road. And so it won't have that kind of economic stability that it will with climate resilient recovery, a green recovery. And that's what's really needed to have growth enhancement and poverty reduction in the long run. And with climate and nature needs that are growing with urgency, as Kevin was saying, the transition risk of inaction is getting bigger and bigger. And I think that's something that the IMF are now kind of picking up on, and as are the World Bank, and trying to integrate these into some of their models, which are quite notoriously short term. So a lot of the economic damages from climate change and from the destruction of nature aren't really being taken into account still in economic forecasts. So what is needed is more forward-looking, more longer-term perspectives on what investment now will yield in 10, 15, 20 years' time for economies. And then I think the impetus for greater investment rather than austerity becomes quite clear.
How do we ensure in the context of structure, this is a follow-on question, can you go a little bit deeper into how we ensure that the recovery is a green and resilient one? What would be the process of sort of structuring a package that provides the needed relief, liquidity, et cetera, and also puts states on good footing to have a sort of economic pathway that is resilient and doesn't create future crises?
So I think a lot of the solutions are already there and known. I think it's just about lining up all the actors to take that on and to support the objectives. So, for example, if you look at the LDC group, they have an initiative, the LDC Initiative for Effective Adaptation and Resilience. And what they're doing with that initiative is going down to the national level within the LDCs and looking to take the group vision, which is for net zero economies by 2030 and climate resilient development pathways, and take that down to the national level. So it is a process of visioning and national strategic planning for each LDC country then, But what the initiative does is support the development of that planning and the integration of climate and nature as a part of resilience in the broader development objectives. So I think it is about taking a look at the economy and building climate and nature resilience into development plans rather than seeing it as an add-on, as a silo. And I think that is already happening on the demand side from the most climate vulnerable, the most nature vulnerable countries already.
What is the process, Kevin, if I can turn to you, the process for ensuring that the voice that we get from borrower states represents a broad set of stakeholders, civil society, and represents the interests of the most vulnerable in those states?
Yeah, thanks, and great points by Sajal. I think one of the things that needs to be attacked and focused on, and it's really important for civil society, for those of you from civil society are focusing on this, is that a lot of work needs to be done to build visions for what a green and just recovery really is in the South, and B, to put pressures on their governments to try to deliver that. There are some countries that are really looking to deliver green transformation, like some of the LDCs that Sajal mentioned, but others that all of their energy sources are really wrapped into the power structure of the country, and they're not necessarily acting on behalf of the full populace. And so there's a key role for civil society here to open up these countries to have a larger debate about what a long run and sustainable development path in those countries are. So for the laggards, we really need civil society. I'm not going to mention any country names, but there's some countries that are steadfast against any movement on a green and inclusive recovery because they see it as against their short-term material interests and the power structures in those countries. That's something real that we have to confront, and that civil society has always been the best vehicle for democratizing power. There's a second group that we also really need to work on, and those are the countries that want to do the right thing, but they realize it's a massive structural transformation that's going to take an incredible mobilization of finance. And for those countries, we have to get beyond just making sure they keep oil in the ground or turn a coal plant into a solar plant tomorrow. We have to actually help them make that structural transformation. That's financing, that's technical expertise, that's adjustment to make sure that the people in, say, the coal plants in South Africa can move into wind and solar. Now, I think the IMF and the South African government alike made a big mistake with the IMF program that went to South Africa, which immediately goes into injections into the state-run electricity and energy company to maintain a coal-based, very inefficient electricity system that fuels the industrialization there. On the one hand, what else could you do? That's where so many middle-class people work that support 10 or 11 people that are also unemployed. And so to cut that off immediately in the first 3 months of a major pandemic, of course, would be terrible. So we helped inject to make sure those people kept their jobs and literally to make sure that the country and industry had its lights on. But then we ended there, right? That's a clear problem, okay? We don't want to put these people out on the street. We don't want to shut down industrialization in the country. Of course, in the short term, you want to keep that liquidity in there. You want to keep those lights on, but then you need an intermediate transformation. And that is where the IMF and the international development banks and the host countries aren't there yet. We need to do serious planning in a South Africa, in a Brazil, in Indonesia about what a transition looks like, who's going to win and lose, how can we make sure that the losers are compensated and can move into sectors that are the more dynamic ones, so that it does foster longer run growth. I think that there's a group of countries that want to do the right thing, that have an ambitious NDC, that A, they're struck with the short-term emergency, and B, they don't see the financing for the real hard structural transformation and the political unlocking that has to happen to make sure that that happens. And that's where we need you folks in civil society, because we need to articulate these visions and we need to put pressure on all four sorts of government and private sector actors that are holding back.
And I suppose if we're really focusing on the poorest people and the most vulnerable, it's not just about least developed countries. That, this crisis has been going, the COVID crisis has been going on for a year now, and I think it's something like over 100 million people have been drawn into extreme poverty in that time, and a lot of them are in middle income countries. How do we kind of configure this to focus on the extreme poor? Kevin, do you have kind of thoughts on that configuration?
Yeah, the World Bank estimates middle income countries are sort of being shut out of a lot of this conversation. The World Bank estimates that upwards of 120 million people have moved back into extreme poverty in the developing world, and that 8 out of 10 of those are in the middle income countries, in the Ecuadors, in the Nigerias, in the Indonesias. They don't get these schemes at the G20. They don't get concessional finance at the World Bank and multilateral development banks. In normal times they can go to the bond markets quicker, but they can go to the bond markets for quicker asks, not for this fundamental transformation, right? Private markets, by definition, we've known this since the 1940s when we created the development finance institutions. They're lacking when it comes to long-run structural transformation, long-run infrastructure finance. That is the reason why we have public development banks. They have to be at the center of this transformation. The good news is most of the development finance is actually in the middle income countries. The French Development Bank and others did a survey of going into the Finance and Commons Summit last year. There's a great report which surveys the state of development finance in the world. The good news is the collective balance sheets of development finance institutions in the world is about $11.5 trillion. And the bulk of them are in national and sub-regional development finance institutions that are in and around middle income countries. Brazil has a monstrous one. There's others in Nigeria. Obviously, the China Development Bank is huge. There are other development banks there's over 463 of them, so I'm not going to mention all of them, but they estimate there's about 463 at $11.5 trillion. We need to think about this as a system. Different kinds of development finance institutions bring different things to the table. The big multilateral ones have nice credit enhancing capabilities, right? They can raise money and offer products that are very cheap, whereas some of the ones that are in the middle income countries they offer higher rates and they're more difficult to finance. So working together with MDBs, they can get lower finance, but those domestic Development Bank of South Africa, for instance, when it works with an MDB, it can get a lower cost for its products, but it knows the local players better. It is more in sync with national planning. We need these institutions to work together more for plans and platforms to be able to create these fundamental transformations. It's going to be the public sector that's going to do that hardcore transformation component. The private sector will come in when we bring certain markets and bring certain technologies to their bankability, but the development finance institutions have to do that big move. We need them now more than ever, given the fact that by nature, the private sector has even moved out of short-term financing for a huge swath of countries, including many middle-income countries.
Man, this just leads to even more questions that I have for the both of you, but we're at times, we're going to have to wrap. Thank you so much for the lively conversation around this and for your time. Have a great day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.